So, hello, Jessica. Great to see you.
You too.
So, thanks everyone. I have the great privilege today of talking with Dr. Jessica Kirzane, who is Professor Jessica Kirzane, who is the assistant instructional professor of Yiddish at the University of Chicago. She is a widely published translator. Her academic articles have appeared in an array of journals. She actually took part in one of my classes last year as well when we discussed her award-winning translation of Miriam Karpilov's novel. And we're here together this evening or this morning for you to talk about Yosef Opetoshu's Lyncherai. So thanks for being here. This is a part of an introductory class to Yiddish literature. And the first thing I want to ask you about is what draws you or what drew you to this story? You both translated it and then you wrote an article about it. So why did you think it needed to be translated and discussed?
Yeah, I've actually written I've written two articles about it. So there's the one that is available, at least excerpted on IngeWeb, that you can see. And there's one that came out very recently in 2020 in a volume called Judaism, Race, and Ethics. And so it's something, I read this story when I was in graduate school at a time when my Yiddish was not excellent, and it took me a long time to read it. And I read it in enormous detail, and it sort of washed over me, and I found it repulsive and extremely moving. It was a very emotional experience for me. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I think about this story quite a lot because it is such a complicated portrayal of American Jewish engagement with the question of race. It is on the one hand an acknowledgement of how deep and horrible the problem of race in America is. On the other hand, it is also participating in that. It is I think in many ways, a very racist story in the way that African Americans' bodies are portrayed and also intellects are portrayed. And so I find it a very problematic, but also in some ways sympathetic story. I wanted to be proud that Yiddish writers cared about this. And I found myself also really disturbed by it at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of IngeWeb, I also failed to mention that Jessica is also the editor-in-chief of IngeWeb. So you can all rush and check out that website, that journal. So you've already gotten into a question I wanted to ask you later, which is that you see Opetoshu as being empathic or interested in racial equality, but also there are things that he didn't see and things he didn't understand. So would you like to just give us some examples of some things you wish he could have understood better?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the very basic, one of the first things that we see in the story, I don't know, did your students read the whole thing or?
Okay. Well, they will by the time they see this.
Okay. Yeah. So it opens up in this portrayal of an African-American man, and he is portrayed as being sort of ape-like. And you see it come up again. There's a part where he's like creeping in the forest as though he were primitive. And so Opetoshu himself, in a lot of his stories, was very interested in the line between animal and human. And he has a whole collection called Menschen und Chayes about this kind of the line between animal and human. So it's not something that he only deals with respect to African Americans, but he is deeply playing into some of the worst stereotypes about a race and in America. And I suspect that that's because I don't know that he ever went to the American South, or that he had at the point that he wrote this. I think he probably had not. He'd only been in America a short time when he wrote this. And so in some ways he is using the imaginative tools available to him as a reader of maybe American literature, as a reader of very sensational reports in newspapers. And he's using that as fuel for some of his major artistic concerns, such as the relationship between human and animal. So he's saying, okay, well, what if I look at a human being that I believe, or I've been led to believe, is more like an animal? Then how does that line between human and animal play out? And that's a really, a racist place to begin. There are also sort of some other really problematic things about the story. One is that it is a story about a lynching that takes place as a result of a rape accusation. An African-American man has been accused of raping a white woman, which is often how these accusations played out. But in this particular case, it happens to be true. The African-American in the story raped a white woman, and he did it retributively. He did it as revenge because his sister was raped. But it's, I think, pretty heinous at this point in history to write a story about an African-American having actually raped a white woman and therefore being lynched, because for the most part, these were false accusations. And so to represent a true one as the basis for this story is really concerning.
So with all of these frustrations or acknowledgments of racial bias in Opatoshu's writing, can you still see his project as something in its context and in its day as something good or productive or leading somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's trying to do something quite radical. This was a standalone story, or maybe even a novella. It's kind of somewhere between a long story and a short novella that was published in the newspaper, and then it is included in a collection called Rasse, Lyncherei, Rasse und andere Erzählungen, which is about, it has this story, but then it has many other sort of shorter stories about race struggle. And they're all about, in a certain way, the way that people try to get along or seem like everything is okay on the surface. There's this kind of surface level of civilization, but then underneath there are these sort of animalistic tensions that bubble up. And as I said, he's very interested in this division between the human and the animal. And so it's about the kind of like basic brokenness of humanity, that people fight each other, that people are inherently cruel to one another. It's this kind of project of realistic naturalism. And so if you see it in that context as being about human brutality, right, then there's it is productive for him in that way, and maybe productive for us in thinking about what early 20th century kind of pessimism about the human condition might look like. And so that's, I think, a helpful framing for it, to take it out of maybe only being about the American lynching context and think about it as part of a kind of broader modernism and pessimistic modernism. But I also think that he's trying to make a case that there is a possibility of escape from this kind of pessimistic reality, and that has to do with adherence to what he sees as a kind of Yiddish ethics or Yiddish morality. And so I wrote about that in the article in Ingevab, that there's these very small moments where we have these Jewish characters who are saying, wait, hold on a minute, we shouldn't be participating in the lynch mob, right? All of these different ethnicities and nationalities, immigrants and so forth are coming together in this lynch mob, but Jews should not be a part of that. They should not take part in American whiteness. They know better because violence has been enacted against them. And so, so you have this kind of this father who comes out and says to his son, don't join the lynch mob. That's not what we should do. And then you have the son who says, okay, dad, but you're just a greenhorn and I want to be American. And so I'm going to go and join the lynch mob. And so there's this kind of moment, and Opatoshu is writing in Yiddish. You can imagine him taking the side of the father and saying, if we hold on to Yiddish, if we hold on to some Yiddish ethos and don't succumb to what is corrupt about American whiteness, then maybe we can not, be these wild animals that humanity seems to be. And so I think that's part of his project as well, is a kind of a Yiddish nationalism that is arguing that there's an ethics of Yiddish that he wants people to enact.
Yeah, and in the article, you talk about it as an issue of memory, right? An intergenerational memory, and those who have the memory of having themselves been in similar positions have more wisdom versus those who have grown up in the American context have less. In fact, in that section where you discuss the intergenerational tension between Harry and Levy, does Mr. Levy have a first name?
I don't think so.
Mr. Levy and Harry, okay. And that Mr. Levy is against the lynching. Harry is trying to fit in by being for it. You say that Harry has, and I quote, faded into American whiteness. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think there's, I think Opatoshu is making a point about what it means to become white in America, because he has this idea of all of these crowds of people with different cultural backgrounds, right? There's this paragraph where he lists all of the different immigrant groups who come together to lynch a Black man. And so it is in the articulating themselves as more, as superior to Black people and being able to enact violence on Black people that they become white and they engage in American white privilege. And so there's a Harry is saying, I want to join that lynch mob. I want to be white, like all these people. The way to be white is to enact violence on Black people. And the father is saying, like, next it will be us. We're not on the side that does the lynching. We're on the side that gets lynched. And so enabling, playing into this kind of violence is actually bad for Jews because we're the next targets. And we don't want to have any part in that. And so he's sort of renouncing, if what it means to be white is to enact racial violence, then Jews should not be part of that. Which has to do with the kind of memory of having experienced that kind of violence.
Where do you see this story fitting into the Yiddish literary canon, or into the if we're not speaking of canon, because we do read works that are outside of the canon, into the flow of the constellation of Yiddish creativity? Does this story relate to anything that came before it? Does anything that came after it draw inspiration from this story?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that this story itself was sort of, I know that this story was widely read in worker circle settings and kind of like liberal Jewish social activist settings. And I think that's because it has a kind of an anti-lynching politics. We can see some continuities, especially in the writing of Baruch Glozman, who was an American Yiddish writer who was very interested also in questions of race, and who also made use of racist stereotype. So he has, again, these kind of like wild, primitive African Americans, and that's an idea that he's playing with in order to construct Jewish identity. And I imagine that there were many others who did that. I only know sort of one-off instances, but I think it's probably something that needs further work. But also,
he was likely read in Europe too, though, right?
Right. It was published in Europe. I think it was likely read in Europe too. And I think that it's also continuous with his interest in the sort of Yiddish underclass, the horse thief, this kind of representing a kind of rougher world, and thinking through it about what it means to be a human being. And we see Sholem Asch doing that with prostitutes, right? We see there's a kind of an interest in what happens if we look at violence, what happens if we look at criminality, what happens if we look at really social problems like poverty, and then where does humanity break down in the encounter with these, dire circumstances? I think that's a question. I think Lamed Shapiro asks that question as well, in his pogrom narratives. And so it's not. I'm not sure that an engagement with race in America doesn't stand apart from, especially pogrom questions about what happens to humanity. I think we can also see it in the City of Slaughter, right? This question of, well, when does humanity break down and become more animal in the face of violence?
Bialik, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
As a final question, how do you think that this story reads today? And I mean that less in terms of seeing what we see as racist, but more in terms of, or in 2020 America, does this story have something? Does does Opetoshu's project have anything to say to American Jewish communities, to Americans at large?
Yeah, it's been interesting that in the past, so I translated this story, I don't know, 6 years ago maybe, and it was published, I think 5 years ago. And then during the Black Lives Matter protests, I started getting contacted by people to talk about it quite a lot. I talked about it for the Yiddish Book Center, and there were a couple of other people, and there were reading groups who were reading it. And that surprised me. I didn't anticipate that. But I did feel that it had some salience for readers today, especially because it is so sort of precariously poised between racism and anti-racism. And I think it helps us sort of recognize that we're products of our own time and that we're probably going to make mistakes that are probably racist. But still there's a responsibility to try to be anti-racist, even if we're stumbling along the way and perpetuating some racism. The things it's not one or the other, right? That this piece is somehow both, and making I feel a real effort to articulate something about ethics, even though it stumbles. And so that, I don't know, feels to me important to say, Jews were not always marching with Martin Luther King, and there's not this kind of image of Jews as being the white ally and that's it, but also that Jews were not sort of like heinously racist entirely, and that it was possible to sort of live in both realities, and that that's I think a much messier and truer thing to be.
Thank you so much, Jessica, my wonderful colleague. This has been great, and I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful discussion around this in class. Thank you so much.
I hope you'll let me know how it goes.
We definitely will. Thank you.
Thank you.